In the dry hills of northwestern Costa Rica, a narrow dirt road cuts between two very different pieces of land. On one side, the ground is pale and open. Thin grass, a few struggling shrubs, cracked earth, and long stretches of nothing. This is what much of this region has looked like for well over 100 years. Step across that road, and everything changes. A wall of green rises out of the ground. Broad-leafed trees crowd together, vines wind through the branches, and the canopy grows so thick that sunlight barely touches the forest floor. The air turns cool. Birds move through the shadows. It is a living jungle. And yet both sides of that road share the same soil. The same rain falls on each of them. They sit just over 300 feet apart, and one side is bare wasteland while the other is dense forest. So why did one half of this land come roaring back to life while the other half stayed dead? The answer goes back more than 20 years to a single unusual decision and to 12,000 tons of orange peels. But this story does not really start with the orange peels. It starts with a grass. To understand what happened on that hillside, you have to go back to what this land used to be, long before any truck ever arrived. Northwestern Costa Rica was once covered in tropical dry forest. It is one of the rarest kinds of forest on Earth, and one of the most endangered. Unlike a rainforest, it survives long dry seasons, months without rain, when the trees drop their leaves and simply wait. When the rains return, the whole forest wakes back up almost overnight. For thousands of years, this forest stretched across the region. Then the cattle came. Over the last few centuries, ranchers cleared enormous areas of this dry forest to make room for grazing. And to feed their cattle, they planted a tough, fast-growing grass brought over from Africa, often called jaragua grass. On a ranch, it was useful. It grew quickly, it survived the dry season, and cattle could eat it. But this grass had a hidden talent. It did not just grow, it took over. Jaragua grass forms thick, dense mats that choke out almost everything else trying to grow in the soil. And in the dry season, it turns into something close to tinder. When fires sweep through, and in this region they often do, the grass burns hot and fast, and any young tree trying to grow gets killed in the flames. The grass, with its deep roots, simply grows back again. So the ranchers had, without ever meaning to, built a trap. They had replaced a forest with a grass that actively stopped the forest from ever returning. By the late 20th century, the ranching across much of this area was fading. Land was being set aside for protection. In theory, that should have been the happy ending. Stop the cattle, protect the land, and the dry forest would slowly heal itself. It did not work that way. Even with the cattle gone and the land protected, the forest could not come back. The jaragua grass was still there, still choking the soil, still feeding the fires. The land was safe on paper and dying in practice. Scientists could see the problem clearly enough. The grass had to go. But you cannot simply pull a grass out of thousands of acres of dry, remote hillside. There was no obvious way to remove it. This is where two ecologists step into the story. Daniel Janzen and Winnie Hallwachs had spent years of their lives trying to bring this exact forest back. They helped build a protected area in the region, a place set aside to let the tropical dry forest recover, and they kept running into that same wall. The land wanted to heal. The grass would not let it. Then, in 1997, an opportunity arrived from an unlikely direction. Not far away, an orange juice company called Del Oro was pressing fruit into juice. And like any juice company, it had a problem. What do you do with all the leftover peels and pulp? Squeezing oranges on a large scale produces mountains of the stuff, and getting rid of it costs real money. Janzen and Hallwachs saw something in that waste that nobody else had. They looked at those rotting orange peels, and they looked at the dead pasture that refused to turn back into forest, and they made a connection. They proposed a deal. Del Oro would donate a piece of its own forested land to the protected area. In return, the company could dump its orange peel waste, free of charge, onto the worst of the ruined pasture inside the park. On the surface, it looked like everyone won. The company got rid of its waste for nothing. The park gained new forested land, and the dead pasture would get a thick layer of organic material that might, just might, help something grow. So the trucks started rolling in. In 1998, around 1,000 dump trucks made the trip, load after load after load. When it was finished, roughly 12,000 tons of orange peels and pulp had been spread across about 7 acres of ruined pasture. If you had stood there at the time, you would not have believed you were looking at the future of forest restoration. You would have seen a vast, sticky, rotting orange mess, crawling with flies, giving off a smell you could probably taste from the road. Someone put up a sign to mark the spot. Then everyone waited to see what would happen. What happened next was a lawsuit. The same deal that was meant to heal the land was about to be branded a crime. A rival juice company called Tico Fruit took Del Oro to court. Their argument was simple and, on its face, reasonable. A private company was dumping thousands of tons of garbage inside a national conservation area. To a lot of people, that sounded less like science and more like a corporation using a protected forest as its personal landfill. The case climbed all the way to the highest court in Costa Rica, and in the year 2000, the court ruled against the deal. The agreement was thrown out, the dumping stopped. Officially, the orange peel experiment was over, and it was labeled a failure, an embarrassment, a mistake best forgotten. The pile of peels was left exactly where it sat. The sign slowly faded, and for the next 16 years, almost nobody gave that patch of land another thought. If the story had ended there, this would be a very different one, but the land was not finished. It was just working quietly, where no one was looking. Now, move forward to the year 2013. A graduate student from Princeton University named Timothy Treuer heard about the old orange peel site. By then, it was little more than a strange footnote, a project that had been shut down and mostly forgotten. He decided to drive out and see what, if anything, had come of it. He went to the coordinates with the old records in hand. And when he arrived, he hit a problem he never expected. He could not find the site. He walked the area looking for the sign that had been placed to mark the plot. The sign was still there, but it was almost completely swallowed by growth, buried under a thick tangle of trees and vines. He had walked straight past the very thing he came to find, because the barren dumping ground in his records was no longer barren. When Treuer finally understood what he was looking at, the scene in front of him was almost impossible to square with the paperwork in his hand. On one side of a small access road sat the control area. This was land that had been left completely alone, never treated, a stand-in for what the pasture would have done on its own. 16 years on, it looked about how you would expect, open and dry, ruled by that same stubborn grass with only a thin scattering of trees. When the team counted, they found about 8 kinds of tree hanging on there. On the other side of the road sat the land where the orange peels had been dumped. It had become a dense, dark, tangled forest. There was a fig tree so enormous that it took 3 grown adults linking arms to reach all the way around its trunk. Vines climbed through a closed canopy overhead. A rainforest weasel, called a tyra, moved through the branches. When the team counted the trees on this side, they found roughly 24 different kinds, many of them the sort you would expect in old established forest. 2 patches of ground, the same age, the same weather, the same starting point, sitting just over 300 feet apart. One was still a wasteland. The other had turned into a forest you could get lost in. And the only real difference between them was a layer of rotting oranges laid down more than a decade and a half earlier. It is the kind of before and after that, if you saw the 2 photographs side by side, you would quietly assume had been faked. It had not been. And at first, even the people standing in that forest could not fully explain how it had happened. Rotting fruit does not normally build a jungle. Something deeper had taken place on that hillside, and it was stranger than a simple dose of fertilizer. If stories like this are the reason you are here, take a second to subscribe before we go on. This channel digs into the hidden ways that broken landscapes come back to life, and there is a new one every week. Because the real question is still sitting right in front of us. How did a pile of fruit waste turn dead ground into a forest so thick you could lose yourself in it? For a long time, the easy assumption was that the orange peels had simply acted as fertilizer. Rotting fruit breaks down, feeds nutrients into the soil, and richer soil grows bigger plants. That part is true, as far as it goes. When researchers tested the treated ground, they found soil far richer than the barren plot beside it, loaded with the nutrients that plants need to grow. But fertilizer on its own does not explain what happened here. People assumed that was the whole story. It was not. Remember the grass. The Jaragua grass was the thing that had kept this land locked in place for generations. It smothered seedlings, and it fed the fires that killed young trees. As long as the grass ruled the ground, no amount of nutrients was ever going to bring a forest back. Now picture what 12,000 tons of orange peels actually did when they landed in a thick blanket across that pasture. They buried the grass. They pinned it down under a heavy, wet layer of decomposing fruit that blocked the light and slowly suffocated it. And this is the part almost everyone missed. The breakthrough here was in what the peels destroyed, not in what they added. With the grass gone, everything changed. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, there was bare, open, nutrient-rich ground with nothing choking it. And in the tropics, bare ground does not stay bare for long. Seeds arrive constantly, carried on the wind, dropped by passing birds, buried by animals. Those seeds had been arriving for decades, and for decades the grass had killed everyone that dared to sprout. Now they finally had their chance. Native trees took root in the soft, rich soil, and once the first pioneer trees rose up, they set off a chain reaction. The young trees threw shade across the ground, which held moisture in and pushed the sun-loving grass back even further. Birds landed in the new branches and brought more seeds with them, seeds of even more kinds of tree. Leaves dropped, rotted, and made the soil richer still. Each new tree made the next one easier. The forest, in a real sense, began to build itself, and because the grass was no longer there to burn, the dry season fires that had wiped out young trees for a century had nothing left to feed on. The single greatest threat to this forest had been quietly switched off. There is a reason this small patch of ground is still discussed by forest scientists today. Years later, when scientists finally measured all of this carefully and published their findings in 2017, the numbers told the story plainly. The plot that had received the orange peels held almost 3 times as much woody growth as the untouched land beside it. The soil was richer. The variety of trees had roughly tripled. One layer of garbage, left alone for 16 years, had produced a measurable, thriving forest where there had been next to nothing. Think about what that really means for a moment. A waste product that a court had officially called an act of pollution turned out to be one of the more effective forest restoration methods anyone had ever stumbled into. What comes next is the part that still gets misunderstood. It would be easy to walk away from this with one simple lesson. Dump food waste on damaged land, and you will grow a forest. That is not what this proves, and the researchers were careful to say so. The result worked because of a very specific combination of things. This was heavily degraded pasture that had lost its forest and been taken over by a single invasive grass. The orange peels happened to be the perfect tool for burying that particular grass, and they happened to release exactly the nutrients that this particular worn-out soil was missing. Pile the wrong waste in the wrong place, and you can poison a wetland, foul a river, or smother a healthy ecosystem that never needed your help. The real key here was the match. The right material dropped onto exactly the kind of broken land it could fix. And there is one more twist, maybe the strangest of them all. Remember that the whole project was shut down and branded a failure. The lawsuit that stopped the dumping was meant to protect the park from what looked like corporate pollution. But that same shutdown is a large part of the reason we learned so much. Because the site was abandoned and forgotten, it was left completely alone for 16 years. Nobody managed it. Nobody interfered. What was left behind was very close to a perfect experiment. A treated plot and an untouched control, sitting side by side, undisturbed for a decade and a half. The interruption that everyone read as the end of the story was the very thing that gave us the cleanest possible proof that it had worked. What had been written off as a failure had quietly become a success. It just took 16 years, and no audience at all, to reveal itself. So step back from this one patch of Costa Rican hillside and look at what it is really telling us. For years, the assumption about this land was that it needed something added to it. It needed more trees planted, more money spent, more effort poured in from the outside. But that was never the true problem. The forest was ready to return the entire time. Seeds were falling on that ground year after year, waiting. The land was not empty because it lacked life. It was being held hostage by one thing, a single invasive grass, and the moment that one obstacle was overwhelmed, a recovery that had been waiting for decades came pouring out. That is the quiet lesson buried under those orange peels. Sometimes a broken ecosystem is not asking us to rebuild it piece by piece. Sometimes it is only asking us to clear away the one thing standing in its way, and then to step back and let it work. We are not always as good as we like to think at reading what a landscape actually needs. The thing that looked like garbage was the cure. The project that looked like a failure was a forest growing in slow motion, and a place that nearly everyone had given up on turned out to be one of the most hopeful pieces of ground in the country. If the idea that removing a single forest can bring an entire landscape roaring back stays with you, then you should see what happened when conservation teams set out to erase an invasive species from an island in the Galapagos. The story of the goats that overran a fragile paradise and the effort to undo the damage is waiting for you on the screen right now. The orange peels are long gone. What they left behind is a forest that by every old rule should not be standing there at all.